The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dense pine forest as Dr. Sarah Chen made her way along the mountain trail, her veterinary bag bouncing against her hip with each careful step. She had been tracking the injured wolf for 3 days, now following blood traces and disturbed undergrowth deeper into the wilderness than she'd ever ventured alone. The locals in Cedar Ridge had spoken of the beast in hushed, fearful tones. Demon wolf, they called it, a massive black creature that had terrorized the outskirts of town for months, killing livestock and sending even the bravest hunters scurrying back to safety. But Sarah saw beyond the fear-mongering. She saw an animal in pain, likely driven to desperation by an untreated injury. When she finally found him, crouched beneath a rocky overhang, her breath caught in her throat. The wolf was enormous, easily twice the size of any she'd encountered in her 15 years of practice. His coal-black fur was matted with dried blood, and his yellow eyes burned with a mixture of pain and pure, unadulterated rage. A steel trap hung from his right hind leg, the cruel metal teeth buried deep in muscle and bone. The wolf's lips curled back, revealing fangs like ivory daggers. A low growl rumbled from his chest, vibrating through the forest floor. Every instinct screamed at Sarah to run, but she slowly lowered herself to the ground 30 feet away, making herself as small and non-threatening as possible. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I'm not here to hurt you." The wolf's ears flattened against his skull, and he shifted his weight, preparing to lunge despite his injury. Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. Wounded predator assessing whether this strange, soft creature posed a threat or presented an opportunity. Instead of retreating, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos of warm broth she'd prepared that morning. The rich scent of beef and herbs filled the air. She poured some into a small bowl and slid it across the forest floor, stopping it just within the wolf's reach. "You must be hungry," she said softly, "and thirsty. That trap. How long have you been carrying that burden?" The wolf's nostrils flared, catching the scent of the food. His growling subsided slightly, confusion flickering across his features. No human had ever approached him without aggression or fear. No human had ever offered him sustenance. Sarah settled back against a tree trunk, making no sudden movements. She pulled out a sandwich and began eating slowly, demonstrating that the food was safe. The wolf watched her every motion, his intelligent eyes cataloguing her behavior, searching for signs of deception or threat. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then gradually the wolf's muzzle stretched toward the bowl. His tongue darted out, tasting the broth tentatively. Finding no poison, no trap, he began to drink more eagerly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "That's it," she murmured. "You don't have to trust me yet, but maybe you don't have to see me as an enemy either." The wolf finished the broth and retreated to his corner, but something had shifted. The raw hostility had dimmed, replaced by wary curiosity. Sarah smiled sadly, noticing how the animal favored his injured leg, how exhaustion lined his powerful frame. For 7 days, Sarah returned to the same spot at the same time each afternoon. She brought food, water, and most importantly, patience. The wolf, whom she'd begun calling Shadow in her mind, no longer growled when she appeared. Instead, he would emerge from his shelter with cautious steps, maintaining his distance but no longer radiating the fierce aggression that had initially marked their encounters. On the 3rd day, she'd brought a camp chair, signaling her intention to stay longer. Shadow had watched with fascination as she unfolded the strange contraption, his head tilting in an almost dog-like gesture of curiosity. She'd laughed softly at his expression, and for just a moment, his ears had perked forward at the sound. "You're wondering what this crazy human is up to, aren't you?" she'd said, settling into the chair with a book. "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. We have all the time in the world." By the 5th day, Shadow had begun to venture closer during their shared meals. He would settle about 15 feet away, close enough that Sarah could see the gold flecks. In his amber eyes, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. The trap had begun to smell of infection, and Sarah's heart ached, knowing the pain he endured with each step. The breakthrough came on the 7th day. Sarah had been reading aloud from a collection of poetry, her voice carrying softly through the forest. Shadow had been lying in his usual spot, but she noticed his breathing had become labored, his movements more sluggish than usual. "Shadow," she called softly, using his name aloud for the first time. The wolf's ears twitched at the sound, and he lifted his massive head to look at her directly. In that moment, Sarah saw something that nearly broke her heart. Recognition. He knew she was speaking to him, knew this was his name in her voice. Slowly, carefully, Sarah rose from her chair and took a single step closer. Shadow tensed but didn't retreat. Another step, his muscles coiled, ready to spring, but he remained still. Sarah knelt down and extended her hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. "I know you're in pain," she whispered. "I know you're scared, but I can help you if you'll let me." For long minutes, they remained frozen in tableau, woman and wolf, predator and healer, locked in a moment of profound understanding. Then, almost imperceptibly, Shadow's nostrils flared as he caught her scent more clearly. He could smell the soap she used, the coffee she'd drunk that morning, the faint antiseptic smell that clung to her clothes from her clinic. But underneath it all, he could smell something else. Compassion. Kindness. The complete absence of threat or deception. His massive head lowered slightly, and Sarah held her breath as he took one cautious step forward, then another. The trap clinked against the rocks with each movement, but Shadow pressed on until he was close enough that Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body. "That's it," she breathed. "That's my brave boy." Shadow's eyes locked with hers, and, in that gaze, Sarah saw the exact moment his instincts shifted. The predator was still there, would always be there, but something new had emerged alongside it, the tentative beginning of trust. Dr. Marcus Webb had thought his colleague had lost her mind when she'd called him at dawn, asking him to drive. 2 hours into the mountains with a portable surgical kit and enough sedatives to take down a bear. But as he crouched behind a fallen log, watching Sarah gently stroke the massive wolf's head while it lay completely relaxed beside her, he had to admit that what he was witnessing defied every principle of wildlife behavior he'd ever studied. "How?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Sarah looked up from where she sat cross-legged next to Shadow, her fingers buried in his thick fur. 2 weeks of showing up, 2 weeks of proving I wasn't a threat, 2 weeks of patience. It had taken 3 more days after their first physical contact for Shadow to allow Sarah to examine his injured leg. The trust had built incrementally, first accepting her touch on his head, then his shoulders, gradually working down until she could assess the damage the trap had caused. The wound was infected, as she'd feared, but not beyond treatment. "He's been eating out of my hand for the past 4 days, Sarah continued, her voice soft so as not to alarm the wolf. "Yesterday, he actually rested his head on my lap for about an hour. I think he's ready." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. In his 20 years as a wildlife veterinarian, he'd never seen anything like this. Wild wolves simply didn't behave this way around humans, especially not a wolf with this animal's reputation for aggression. "The townspeople are calling it a miracle," Marcus said, unpacking his equipment with careful, quiet movements. "They're saying the demon wolf has been tamed by an angel." Sarah laughed softly, earning a sleepy look from Shadow. "He was never a demon. He was just hurt and afraid. When you're in pain, you lash out at anything that comes close. It's basic survival instinct." As if understanding her words, Shadow lifted his great head and nuzzled against Sarah's shoulder, a gesture so gentle and trusting that Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. This was the same animal that had terrorized an entire community, that had sent grown men running in fear. "All right, Shadow," Sarah murmured, producing a small syringe from her bag. "This is going to help you sleep while we fix your leg. I promise. You'll wake up feeling much better." The wolf's eyes tracked the movement of the needle, and for a moment Marcus tensed, expecting the animal's survival instincts to kick in. But Shadow simply looked at Sarah's face, seemed to find whatever reassurance he needed there, and settled back down with a soft exhale. The injection was quick and efficient. Within minutes, Shadow's breathing had deepened, and his massive frame relaxed completely. Sarah's hand never left his head, her voice maintaining a steady stream of soothing words even as the wolf drifted into unconsciousness. "Incredible," Marcus breathed, moving closer to examine the trap. "This has been embedded for weeks. The infection should have killed him by now." "Stubbornness," Sarah said simply, "and maybe he was waiting for someone to care enough to help." The surgery took 2 hours. Marcus worked with practiced efficiency while Sarah monitored Shadow's vital signs and maintained her protective vigil. When they finally extracted the trap, the relief was palpable. The cruel metal device had left deep gouges in the wolf's leg, but the bone was intact, and with proper care, the wound would heal completely. "He's going to be fine," Marcus announced, applying the final bandage. "Better than fine, actually. Once this heals, he'll be stronger than before." As if summoned by those words, Shadow's eyes began to flutter open. His gaze immediately sought Sarah's face, and when he found her there, exactly where she'd been when he'd fallen asleep, something that might have been a smile crossed his lupine features. "Welcome back, beautiful," Sarah whispered, her hand finding its familiar place behind his ears. "How do you feel?" Shadow's tail, which had never once wagged in all their previous encounters, gave a single, tentative thump against the ground. 3 weeks after the surgery, Sarah sat in her clinic in Cedar Ridge, updating Shadow's medical chart when a commotion outside drew her attention. Through the window, she could see a crowd gathering in the town square, their voices raised in animated discussion. But what captured her attention was the familiar black shape moving through the crowd with calm confidence. Shadow had come to town. Sarah rushed outside, her heart racing with a mixture of pride and concern. The wolf should have been resting in the forest, allowing his leg to heal completely. Instead, he was here, navigating the human world with the same trust he'd learned to place in her. "Dr. Chen," called out Martha Henley, the town's librarian, "your wolf is looking for you." Indeed, Shadow was moving methodically through the crowd, his nose working to track Sarah's scent. When he spotted her emerging from the clinic, his entire demeanor changed. His tail began wagging, a sight that drew gasps from the assembled townspeople, and he trotted directly to her side, favoring his healing leg only slightly. "Shadow, what are you doing here?" Sarah asked, kneeling to examine his bandaged leg. "You should be resting." The wolf's response was to press his massive head against her chest, nearly knocking her over with the force of his affection. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the feared predator of their nightmares transformed into something resembling an oversized wild dog, showing devotion to his person. "I'll be damned," muttered Tom Rodriguez, the town's former mayor. "That's the same beast that had us all scared to leave our houses after dark." Sarah looked up at the gathered faces, seeing the wonder and confusion in their eyes. "He was never a beast," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "He was a patient, and like any patient, once you treat the source of their pain, they remember how to trust." Young Emma Patterson, barely 10 years old, broke free from her mother's grip and approached cautiously. "Can I pet him?" she asked, with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Emma, no," her mother called out, but Sarah held up a reassuring hand. "Shadow," Sarah said softly. "This is Emma. She's a friend." The wolf turned his golden gaze to the little girl, and something extraordinary happened. His entire posture shifted, becoming even gentler, more careful. He lowered himself to the ground, making himself less imposing, and waited. Emma approached with careful steps, her small hand extended. When she finally made contact with Shadow's fur, her face lit up with pure delight. "He's so soft," she exclaimed, "and warm." One by one, other townspeople began approaching. Sarah watched in amazement as Shadow greeted each person with patient tolerance, allowing pets and gentle touches from people who had once feared him. It was as if her kindness had awakened something in him, not just trust in her, but a capacity for connection with humans in general. "How did you do it?" asked Pastor Williams, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "How did you tame a wild animal?" Sarah considered the question carefully, her hand resting on Shadow's head as he sat beside her like a devoted guardian. "I didn't tame him," she said finally. "I just showed him that not all humans are threats, that some of us can be trusted, that kindness exists." Dr. Webb, who had been watching from the crowd, stepped forward with a professional smile. "What Dr. Chen accomplished here goes beyond veterinary medicine," he announced. "She's demonstrated something that science is only beginning to understand about the capacity for interspecies bonding and trauma recovery." Shadow's ears perked up at the sound of Dr. Webb's voice, recognizing the human who had helped heal his leg. The wolf's tail wagged again, this time more vigorously, and he approached the veterinarian with the same trusting demeanor he showed. "Sarah." "The remarkable thing," Dr. Webb continued, accepting Shadow's gentle greeting, "is that this wolf has not only learned to trust humans, but he's apparently generalized that trust. He's not just bonded to Dr. Chen, he's learned that humans can be safe." As if to prove his point, Shadow returned to Sarah's side and settled down, his body language relaxed and content. The crowd of townspeople who had once crossed the street, to avoid even speaking of the demon wolf, now stood in a circle around him, marveling at the transformation. "He's not the same animal that was terrorizing our livestock," observed rancher Bill Morrison, shaking his head in wonder. "It's like he's civilized." Sarah smiled, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "He's exactly the same animal. He's just not in pain anymore, and he's learned that the world doesn't have to be a constant threat." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the newly constructed Wildlife Rehabilitation Center on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, watching Shadow demonstrate to a group of veterinary students how a wild predator could cooperate with medical treatment. The wolf lay calmly on the examination table, allowing Dr. Webb to check his fully healed leg, while Sarah monitored his vital signs. "The key," Sarah explained to the rapt students, "is understanding that aggressive behavior is often a symptom, not a personality trait. Shadow wasn't born mean. He was made desperate by circumstances beyond his control." The rehabilitation center had been the town's idea, funded by donations from people who had heard Shadow's story. What had started as one woman's act of compassion had grown into something much larger, a place where injured wildlife could receive treatment without the fear and stress that typically accompanied human contact. Shadow had become the center's unofficial ambassador, his presence helping to calm other frightened animals. Sarah had watched in amazement as the wolf's gentle nature extended to other creatures in need. He seemed to understand that this place was about healing, and he appointed himself as a source of comfort for the scared and injured. Dr. Chen called out Jessica, one of the students. "Is Shadow happy living here instead of in the wild?" Sarah looked over at the wolf, who was now accepting gentle pets from the students with patient dignity. "Shadow chooses to be here," she said. "The doors are always open. He comes and goes as he pleases, spends time in the forest when he wants to hunt or run, but he always comes back. It was true. Shadow had never been caged or confined. He had simply chosen to make the rehabilitation center his home base, perhaps, understanding that his presence here served a purpose beyond his own needs. The sound of a car pulling up outside drew everyone's attention. Through the window, Sarah could see a state wildlife officer getting out of his vehicle, accompanied by what appeared to be a family with 2 young children. "That'll be the Henderson family," Sarah explained. "They found an injured fox kit in their backyard. Shadow will help us show them that not all wildlife encounters have to end in fear." As the family entered the center, Sarah watched their expressions change from apprehension to wonder as they took in the sight of the massive wolf calmly interacting with the students. The youngest child, a girl about Emma's age, immediately gravitated toward Shadow. "Can I touch him?" she asked, echoing the question Emma had posed months earlier. "Shadow," Sarah said softly, "we have a new friend." The wolf's response was immediate and gentle. He lowered himself to the ground, his tail wagging slowly, and waited for the child's approach. When small fingers touched his fur, his eyes closed. Contentedly. "I don't believe it," breathed the wildlife officer. "Is this really the same wolf that had 3 counties on alert last year?" "The very same," Sarah confirmed. "Amazing what a little patience and kindness can accomplish." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this point. Shadow's transformation had been remarkable, but it had catalyzed something equally important in the human community. The town that had once lived in fear of the demon wolf now took pride in their rehabilitation center, in their resident wolf ambassador, in their reputation as a place where healing was possible. Dr. Webb joined her at the observation window, where they could watch Shadow, lying peacefully in the afternoon sun, surrounded by recovering animals and admiring visitors. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what you said that first day, about how he was just hurt and afraid." "What about it?" "I think that applies to more than just wolves. I think maybe a lot of the aggression and fear we see in the world comes from the same place. Pain that hasn't been properly treated, trust that's been broken and never repaired." Sarah nodded, watching as Shadow gently nuzzled a nervous rabbit kit, offering comfort to another creature in need. "Maybe," she said softly, "that's the real lesson here. That kindness isn't just about being nice. It's about seeing past the surface behavior to the need underneath. It's about believing that healing is possible, even when everyone else has given up." Shadow looked up then, as if sensing her gaze, and their eyes met through the glass. In that moment, Sarah saw not the fierce predator she'd first encountered, but a friend, a partner, a living testament to the transformative power of compassion. His tail wagged once, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed everything: gratitude, trust, and the unbreakable bond that had grown between them. Then he settled, back down, returning to his chosen role as guardian and healer, the wild heart that had learned to love.